Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 87, and today we're going to be talking about resources in Limited. So all the stuff that you use in Limited, we're going to try to figure out what are those resources, and we're going to dive into the 17lands.com replay data, something I very rarely do because that data set is massive and convoluted and not always accessible for every set, but for this set we got it. So I decided I'm going to dedicate countless hours to try to figure out what's going on in there, to maybe draw some kind of macro kind of trends in Limited. Normally we look at very set specific things, but this time we're going to look at things like, if you utilize more mana than your opponent, are you more likely to win the game, and exactly how big is that effect? Or if you miss a land drop on turn 3, how badly does it affect your win rate? Obviously, this is still based on one set, so to some extent, it is going to be set specific because this set is unique, as every set is. So there will be some idiosyncrasies that are related to this particular set. Keep that in mind. But before we move into that, I would like to thank my sponsors, and first and foremost, mtgazone.com, where if I find 5 minutes to do it, I do write articles. I'm honestly planning to write this one up because I think that this is important and universal enough that it's a good content to have at hand, and without having to listen to my hour or 2 hours of blabbing, and just read it quickly, look at the graphs. So I'm trying to put this one together in a nice write-up version. But it's also sponsored by you through my Patreon, which I highly recommend you to use and subscribe to. And I have new patrons, so I would like to thank Tabby Cat, I would like to thank Tal, Pingus Pangus, and Thomas for joining the Patreon this week. Thank you guys, it's amazing. So yeah, there are some benefits for joining it, obviously, as Patreon does. One of them is access to the slides, because this is released as a YouTube video and it's available as a VOD on Twitch. But if you want to just calmly look at the slides while you're listening to the podcast version, or just do you want to have access to the archive of my slides, it's a good thing. It's a good way of doing it. Okay, so let's start with the preamble. Always something to warm me up before I start blabbing about data. And this is about laziness of us, so people that create content using data, me included, foremostly probably. And its unwillingness to look at data creates whole areas where opinions rule. And of course, I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of Magic. Replay data is one of those things that it's a treasure trove of conclusions that you can get, because basically you have everything in this data set. How often you played creatures, how important are 2-drops, but it's a complicated data set, and it requires a lot of data manipulation to get any kind of conclusions. Lots of those, I can tell you from my own personal experience, lots of those you try to pursue, you spend hours on looking through, and you don't draw any kind of logical conclusions because set specifics, because there are multiple archetypes that are very different from each other. But I think that this data set is the thing that I would like to have if I would be to analyze constructed data. For example, having replay data like 17lands replay data would be a game changer for figuring out plans, and it would honestly, I think, revolutionize how people play constructed to the extent that is not even possible with limited, because limited, the main strength of the format and why we all love it is diversity of approaches and the inconsistency of the decks. That's why we love it, because it's the jazz music of Magic the Gathering, while constructed is the symphonies. But of course, because we don't look into this data, there is a lot of areas where opinions still rule. Most of those opinions are probably going to be confirmed if you look into the data deep enough, because they are based also on hundreds of repetitions, on collective wisdom of Magic players. But I think that we can do slightly better, and this is like one of the approaches, one of the attempts today to try to look at this macro data in a bit of more detail, to try to figure out those like super long-standing heuristics that might seem obvious, and see exactly how obvious are. And apart from confirming, because intuition will tell you, yes, if you overspend your opponent on mana, you probably are going to be likely to win the game. But what is the size of this effect is also something interesting to look at, because it's not only important to say, yeah, spending more mana is good, but to what extent it's good and how consistent it is across different levels of outspending your opponent is something that might be partially interesting. But before we go to the main topic, I wanted to look at the metagame evolution very briefly, how the things changed between last week and this week. And this is the play frequency of different archetypes. As you can see from the graph, and if you can't see, then you're listening to the podcast, I can tell you there's not much of differences between the frequency of the archetype plays. There is a bit more is it being played. It was 23.3% last week. This week it's 24.6%. And a bit less Rakdos and a small drop in Boros. Basically, Boros was falling out of favor, especially with the top players since the beginning of the format. I think that first week it was open enough and you could wheel those rallies at the Hornburg that the archetype was good. But now, because people draft so much Izzet, rally at the Hornburg is heavily contested, and because of that, Boros is losing quite a lot of its power. So apart from that, no major changes in terms of how frequently people play different archetypes. What was interesting this week in terms of win rates is that almost across the board, we see that 17 lens users were winning more with decks, each color combination basically, than they were last week. Oh, sorry, by the way, on the axis it says Rakdos plus Splash, but actually it counts both splashed and non-splashed versions of it. Biggest improvements were in Selesnya, which was quite low last week at 52%. Now it's at 54%. So 2 percentage points increase. Also, Gruul increased from 51 to 53, but these are the weaker archetypes. Simic is continuously being one of the weakest ones and didn't get any improvement this week. In terms of what I would call good archetypes, I think that Boros, apart from falling out of favor with players, it also is the one that is the least winning archetype. I think that what you can say about Boros in this format, and I would refer you to the last week's episode about format evolution. Aggro decks are usually good in week one because their plans are very simple, so it's easy to make decks. But as people learn how to play the format better, as they understand the synergies, as they understand the card power better, as they understand which cards are the key important pieces that you need, those aggro decks are very often falling out of favor and stop winning. Boros had a very high win rate first weeks, around 59%. Now it's at 54%, and it's firmly out of the top 5 archetypes. It has been replaced actually by Golgari, which also improved by 1 percentage point. That deck was always like in between good decks and bad decks, and now it's slowly clawing its way into the good deck tier at 56%. Dimir is sort of stagnating, I think, mainly because blue is more challenged because people draft more Izzet, and black is still drafted quite highly because Rakdos is still popular. So that one is stagnating at 56.5% win rate. And the top 3 decks we have is Orzhov, which was solid all through the format and never got like any hype. No one was ever like singing praises of Orzhov decks, but it was always doing really solid. And I think it's like if I would be asked about the secret tech for this format, I would say Orzhov is probably the one that is not getting enough attention compared to what is winning. It's got now average 57% win rate, and it's just like 0.3% lower than Izzet, which is at 57.2, and 0.4% lower than Rakdos, which is at 57.3. So really close to those 2 best decks. And just a quick reminder to you that Izzet and Rakdos are basically 20% and 25% of all the 2-color decks, and Orzhov is only 10%. So it's significantly underdrafted compared to everything else. And if you see white open and you get some black cards, probably it's not a bad thing to do. And yes, I see in the chat Denethor is carrying hard. Denethor is a really good card, but also the 2 mana make 2/1/1 spirits card is going pretty late still, so you can get that very frequently because it's, you can't splash it in the legend archetype because it's a black-white. you probably will not splash it in any spells decks because it's just not worth it. So you probably will have it if you're the only Orzhov drafter in the pot. So that's maybe one conclusion from the data from the last couple of weeks that we can look through. But all right, let's move to the main topic. And resources in limited games. I mean, obviously there's many resources, but I would like to look at 4 main ones. For me, at least, that's mana, cards, life, and time. And obviously, all of them are intertwined. You can spend each of them to gain some other one. So, for example, you play a control deck, you will spend some cards to gain time so that you can stabilize. You can use your life as a resource, as Arena hints tell you all the time, by basically letting some attacks through, not to have to trade creatures to get up on cards and build to that stabilization. Obviously, you use mana to play your cards, which can buy you time, and all of those things are intertwined. The key of winning in Magic is optimizing trades between those resources. So, in a perfect world, you're going to win by playing every single card that you ever drew in the game, using all the mana that you possibly could, and staying at 1 life, and then killing your opponent, because then you use all your resources to the maximum without losing the game. But of course, in some games, you're just going to overwhelm your opponent. In some games, you're going to get overwhelmed, and your resources are not going to be enough to stabilize. But exactly, how do those game disproportions impact the limited game results? How do disproportion in usage of those resources affect your win rate? So I looked in those replay data, and again, as I said earlier, it's a rarely used subset of 17lands.com. For arguably good reasons, it's hard to analyze. It's time-consuming. Those files are absolutely massive. I actually had to trim the file to only 50,000 games because it would just take me too long to analyze it if it was more than that. Because you have like a table with something like 1,400 columns in the full data set, and 1,400 columns of let's say a couple of 100,000 records takes long time to analyze. It just stalls my not excellent computer, and it's just too much for one or the other reason. But having said that, the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that it's not useful. It's potentially groundbreaking, as it's the realistically only way to look at some things. Like, for example, play ability. You can look through analyzing those logs. Because it codes every card that was played, every card that was drawn, every card that was discarded, every card that, every attack, every life swing, every life gain, every discard effect. All of those things are logged in the data set. And if you had infinite time, I'm not saying that you could solve the game, but you could definitely make some answers. And I said already in the preamble, I think this particular type of data would have been absolutely groundbreaking for Constructed, because if you can analyze, let's say, 100,000 games played with mono red aggro, and you could see in those games what percentage of them you had 1-drop play, and what percentage of those games that you had the 1-drop you won, and if you didn't win, what did opponent have to do not to lose? You could really go in depth, and you can figure out which decisions you should make while mulliganing, for example, which hands are automatic keeps, which counterintuitive plays can be something that will make you win more. Should you use your burn spell to kill a blocker, or should you conserve your burn spell to later use it on your opponent's life total? All those kind of things can be answered, and they wouldn't be giving you absolute answers. They won't tell you 100% you should do this, but if it can tell you that, look, if they have a 3/3 blocker, it's better to build up your board a bit and then swing and use the burn spell to attack their life total. 60% of the time, it's a good strategy. 40% of the time, it's a bad strategy. you are gaining like a big edge in those games because you at least have a decent heuristic, sort of like, which hand of poker you should be playing. If you know the percentages of that, you're going to probably win more than the person who has no idea about stats of pocket sevens. What advantage do pocket sevens give you pre-flop? Of course, the cost of that kind of analysis is the sanity of whoever wants to start and analyze it. So yeah, here I am 5 days after I started looking at this data. I had a full head of hair, and I was 25 years old. Now I'm just an old, miserable, bald guy. So what is in the replay data? Because maybe you never looked at this data set, because most of you probably wouldn't even have, like, probably if you open it in Excel, you probably just break your computer because you run out of memory and it just stalls. So what is in the replay data? There's the deck list. There is each draw step. There is mana spent each turn. There is a list of every creature that was played and every creature that died each turn from both players. There is a list of all cards that were discarded, including what cards were those. There's the list of all the lands that were played, all the attacks that were made, all the life swings that happened during those turns, and actually much more. There's even how many spells you foretold, even in the sets that you don't have foretell. So and how many lessons did you learn in the sets that don't have lessons. So there's like a lot of redundant data that probably, it would be nice to remove it when you open the data set, which I actually did, because otherwise I would be just go crazy trying to analyze it. So how to approach even analyzing this data set? And because I don't do it frequently, I have and because I'm the only one that probably does it, I never saw anyone analyzing it. I have a pretty much relaxed situation here, because I pick what is important and what is not important. And that's a big benefit of being a pioneer in something. So I approach it, I want to look at the general macro trends. And by that, I mean, I look at the broadest application of this data possible. I don't go into the details of what happens when I play a 2/2 Goblin on turn 2, even though it is possible. And which 2-drop is the best would be an analysis that you can potentially do in this data set. But I don't look at it. I look at general resource use, how much mana do players spend in the game, and is one of the players spending more mana than the other. I looked at the measuring those disparities and how do they impact the win rate, and try to display it in a graphic form, which is also another pain, because these are big data sets with lots of possibilities. So the display in the graphic form is somewhat challenging, as you will see in a second. So start with, let's look at life, because life is the thing that makes you win or lose games in Magic most of the time. And in this analysis, I looked at each turn. I looked at the difference of life totals between players. And I looked at, from the perspective of the player who was on play and on the draw, to see the difference. And then the outcome was, how does life advantage translate to win rate? So if you have early life advantage, are you more likely to win? And this is not an obvious answer here, because, like when you outspend your opponent on mana, I guess you probably could conclude, yes, I spend more mana, I cast more spells, or I cast more impactful spells because of that. Therefore, I'm more likely to win. But life is a resource. So if you play a slower deck, maybe you're going to start off losing a lot of life in the early stages, but later you can stabilize and take over the game and win. So it might be that in some formats, actually, the life advantage early in the game is not going to be very meaningful, because if you imagine like those old school formats where games were lasting 20 turns and aggro was not a viable strategy, whoever picked an aggro strategy and gained an early life advantage probably was disadvantaged in the long game, because those formats were not conducive to playing aggro strategies. But what do we have here is a very unreadable graph of how do life totals swing. And if you really look with the magnifying glass, you have a 0 here in the middle of the graph. And above it, you have numbers from -1 to -20. And below it, you have numbers from 1 to 20. And this means that 0 is when both players have the same amount of life. And -20, it means that one of the players has 20 life more than the others. And if it's -20, specifically, it says player that is on the draw has more life. And if it's +20, it's players on the play has more life. And that looks at both 17 lens user and their opponents. So it's sort of equilibrated for that. I looked at the games from both sides. Each game that was logged, I looked because I have life totals of both players, so I can look at it. This also means that the average win rate of the whole data set is 50% because I look at both players. Unlike most data sets in 17 lens, when it only looks at the 17 lens users, and 17 lens users have 56, 57% win rate. Then there are numbers, and the numbers in the table are the win rate of player on the play in all cases. And unfortunately, they are small, but I will have some zoomed versions of it so that you can look at it more directly. And also, what I have here is I have 6 columns, and these columns represent turns. So I look at turns between turn 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Because I would guess that the impact of the life differences is going to vary as the game gets longer. Now, of course, this comes with another problem that, of course, most games will last till turn 3, but not every game will last till turn 8. So obviously the data set for the last column is smaller because some of the games already are finished by turn 5, 6, or 7. And obviously the biggest data set will be the one from turn 3 because there are fewer games that end on turn 3. Another drawback of that is that, of course, by turn 3, the life swings are not going to be massive. I only looked at data points where at least 100 games were taken into account. So if we look at that from this perspective, the differences in life total by turn 3 between players are between -6 and +6. So either the player on the play has 6 life more or 6 life less than the opponent. And if you go beyond that, there's just not enough sample size to fulfill the threshold that I set for myself. And what you can also see is the colors of the graphs. And because it's hard to see the numbers because of how many rows and columns you have in it, I decided to go for the color one. And red means high win rate. So the player on the play wins a lot of games. And the blue means low win rate. So the player on the play is more likely to lose that game. And what you can see without even looking at numbers or anything is that, well, basically, the more life you have more than your opponent, the more likely you're going to win. So if you look at the turn 3, if you're at life parity on turn 3, a player that is on the play has like 51.4% win rate. If they are already 2 life behind the player on the draw, that win rate drops to 41%. And if they are 2 life ahead of the player that was on the draw, their expected win rate is going to be like 60.2%. So big swings between those numbers already. So you can see that just the 2 life difference on turn 3 means that you can have 60, 50, or 40% win rate roughly. Don't worry, we're going to zoom into those so that we can look at it more in detail. So this is just looking at small life swings between -3, so the player on the draw has 3 more life, or +4, the player on the draw has 4 more life than the player on the draw. And what you can see is that at turn 3, when the life is at parity, the player that is on the play has 51.4% win rate. And this is related to the fact that being on the play is beneficial because you can, make those first punches. You take the initiative. You are the aggressor in those games if everything goes according to plan. But already at turn 4, if you're still at life parity by that time, Player that is on the draw gets advantage because player on the play only has 49.8% win rate. So if you don't capitalize on your advantage of being on the play early and you're still at life parity by turn 4, all of a sudden the opponent is very, very marginally but favored. And at turn 5, this parity already drops to 49.2%. At turn 6, 47.8%. At turn 7, 47.2%. And then it sort of is in the area of like 47, 48% win rate. So the whole advantage of being on the play is not that you're on the play and that's it. It's that you have a chance of gaining that first initiative. It's that you have a chance of being the aggressor. You are the beatdown. And if you manage to do that, you very often will force your opponent to make choices that they are not happy with. And this is the whole advantage of being on the play, forcing your opponent to do something that they would not have done if they didn't have to. And if you don't capitalize on it, you all of a sudden start not being favored. What we can also see from this is that that early life advantage, like on turn 3, you get 60% win rate if you're 2 life ahead and you were on the play. On turn 4, it drops to 56, and then it drops to roughly 54. And at turn 8, even if you're 2 life ahead, your win rate, expected win rate, is going to be only 50%, 50.5 to be precise. That might be slight variation in the data, but it means that your chances of winning, if you're not increasing that life advantage, are going to be diminished by that time. So very important. And also, one thing you can see, if you get 4 life advantage at turn 3, all of a sudden you have 68% expected win rate. So if you get really out of the blocks and you manage to push a lot of damage in the first couple of turns, you are going to be massively favored in that game. And this is why most likely cards like Rally at the Hornburg are just so good, because I think that in the process of the set review, lots of people didn't treat Rally at the Hornburg as a 2/2 haste creature. And 2/2 haste creatures are really, really powerful in limited for if they are costing 2 mana, because that's the really that really lets you create a situation when your opponent is going to have to make difficult choices later in the game. Yes, and already I can see comments in the chat, so bolt face on turn 2 after attacking with my 1-drop makes me almost certain to win. Now, obviously, these are large numbers, and one big assumption I'm making in this data is that people who are in this data probably want to win. And obviously, you could play turn 1 Ranger's Bolt and turn 2 another Ranger's Bolt, and you're 4 life ahead. But that's probably not a great strategy because you wasted a solid tempo card on attacking face when you could have used it to maybe promote your board presence. I assume that people that are in the data set, majority of them want to win, and they try to play as well as they can. And because of that, I'm trusting that the data is, I'm doing what economists do. I'm assuming a rational consumer here, but in my case, it's a rational player, and I think I have more standing on a rational player than economists do have on a rational consumer, because I've been to supermarket when I was hungry and I bought rubbish. So definitely, rational consumer doesn't exist, but at least Magic player, they do like to win, so I'm really hoping that they try to do their best. And if they don't, we can always exclude players with lower win rates from the data set, and we'll probably reach the kind of same conclusion. Actually, probably a much stronger conclusion where those advantage would be even higher. What is interesting is that when you don't start very well, and when you are 3 life behind in the first couple of turns as a person who was on the play, that disadvantage does not increase over time that much. So you're 40% to win the game if you're 3 life behind on turn 3, and you're same 40% to win the game if you're still 3 life behind on turn 8. And that's relatively flat across the board, which I thought was an interesting piece of data. And it looks the same for being 2 life behind. Don't have a very good explanation why that is, but I thought it would be nice to draw attention to it. Now, this is a plot of the life difference on turn 6 to win rate of the player on the play. And as you can see, it's like almost a straight line that goes from 10% chance of win if you're 15 life behind on turn 6. And it goes up to like roughly 90% win rate when you're 15 life ahead on turn 6. And it goes really quite stably up between those numbers, like the R square, a metric that I've been using in previous seminars that shows you how well does the straight trend line fit the data points from my data. It's almost 1, which means that it almost perfectly fits the straight trend line. But what's interesting in here, and I never put the equation of the straight line on my previous charts, but here I decided to put it because this number 0.0249, that's actually a size of this effect. So it shows you the slope of that straight line. And in this case, this 0.0249, that's 2.5% basically. And this means that for every mana, for every life point difference, the win rate changes by roughly 2.5% on turn 6. So if you're 1 life ahead, you're going to have 2.5% percentage points higher win rate than if you were at life parity. If you were at 2 life advantage, it will be 5 percentage points difference, and so on and so on and so on. Because this line is almost perfectly fitting, it's quite a good predictor. So you basically see that life advantage on turn 6 is roughly 2.5 percentage points per life that you have over or under your opponent. It goes in both ways, of course. And this number will not be the same for each turn. And that's what we see in the next graph. As the game progresses, this 1 life point difference is getting smaller and smaller. So we already looked at the turn 6 in the first graph. That's 2.5%. At turn 3, the 1 life point difference is actually translates into 4.2 percentage points win rate. So if you're 2 life ahead, you will get roughly 8.4% percentage points higher win rate than if you were at parity. At turn 4, it's only 3.5%, so a significant drop. At turn 5, 2.8, and then it sort of slows down the drop. So it's 2.5 at turn 6, as we mentioned, 2.3 at turn 7, and 2.1 at turn 8. And yes, I see in the chat that's a tightly correlated data set. And that tight correlation shows me that this is probably a real effect in terms of the life. And obviously, I'm pretty sure if we would look at it for specific archetypes, we might get some kind of maybe different results, maybe less correlation between the life differences and the win rate for control decks. And it would be interesting to explore sometime in the future, but I didn't have time to do that kind of stuff. But as a general trend, it works really, really well. And the correlation is equally strong for every turn that I analyzed, because I did it for every single time point. And it's R square for those, all of those is way above 95%, so 0.95. So yeah, it's pretty tightly correlated at every level. But of course, we arrive at the problem of correlation. Now, correlations are neat. They show that two things are mathematically linked, and change in one translates into a change in the other one. But it does not imply any causation, or even if there is a causation, it doesn't tell us what is the direction of this relationship. And if we look at the life differences, is it that life differences determine the win rate? Or maybe is it that life differences are a reflection of a board state? Which one is which one is the cart and which one is the horse that's pulling it? That's the very important thing. And I can't reply with the analysis I did to which one is which, but my intuition would tell me that life differences are a proxy of game state, and not vice versa. It's not life that determines who wins the game. It's that life changes because the board state is in a particular way. If you are 4 life behind on turn 3, it means that you've been attacked a couple of times, and you lost some life, and because of that you're behind, and not that this life loss all of a sudden made you lose the game. So I would say that in here, life is just a good proxy of how the game is going, and that's how you should look at those life total data. There we had the life, which I think is a proxy of the game state, and here we have mana, and this might be a very different relationship, because spending mana is happening before life totals get changed. So this is the thing that is driving those life swings. If you spend more mana, you technically play either bigger or more creatures, and if you play bigger or more creatures, you're going to get into situations when those life totals are going to start to change. So in my opinion, mana is a bigger driver of what's going on, and it's more of a predictor than a proxy for what's going on. So we have exactly the same graph as we had with life total, but of course here it's the advantage of how much mana people spent by a given turn. And here I'm looking from turns 1 to 10, because I think that I thought at least that it's important to see how important it is to spend mana already on turn 1. And we have, again, 0. It means that both players spend the same amount of mana during the game at this stage. Minus, it means that the player on the draw used more mana than the player on the play. And I could expect that this is going to happen actually quite frequently in games, that the player on the draw is going to be using more mana because they have an extra card, which means that they are less likely to miss land drops and they are more likely to draw spells. So player on the draw should technically have a mana advantage over the player on the play. They don't have the initiative, but they have the resource advantage in cards. And then player on the play used more mana is, of course, the positive number here. And as you can see, this is not a proportional graph. So the numbers for player on the draw go from 0 to 17. So it did happen more than 100 times that and that player on the draw at turn 10 spent 17 mana more than the player on the play. But the numbers on the play only go to 13, which means that it's less likely that player on the play will outspend the opponent on mana. And of course, the win rates this time, because I am not a consistent person, but also because I got some comments from people on Twitter. This time I'm looking at not per se win rate, but a diversion from the average win rate. So if you have minus numbers, this means that your win rate in that particular scenario is going to be lower than the average win rate. And if the numbers are in plus, it means that your win rate is going to be higher. So if I have 2.4% here and the average is 50%, that means that the win rate here will be 52.4%. But because I have non-50% win rate for some reason, I know the reason, I just don't feel like explaining why. This actually 0 is 52%. It's basically because I'm cutting off the games that last longer than 11 turns. Fundervunk is asking, does this count spending mana for cycling or just casting spells? No, it counts using abilities. It counts cycling. It counts any kind of mana use, which can generate some stuff like you can move equipment 4 times in 1 turn and spend a lot of mana but achieve nothing. I'm again working under the assumption that people use their stuff rationally, and yes, it did happen to me that I moved equipment 3 times in one turn because I was not happy with my first choice, and it will happen, but I think it's just such a marginal situation that it won't impact the data set per se. But here you see exactly the same situation as the last time. Outspending on mana increases the win rate of the person on the play. Spending less mana is decreasing the win rate of the person that is on the play. And obviously it will work vice versa, because if I would make the same table for the player on the draw, I would just flip it and multiply everything by -1. So here we again will zoom into this, because of course it's nice to see that if you're on the draw and you outspend the player on the play by 10 mana by turn 5, you are like 94% more likely to win. But it's fringe situations, I assume. I think that where most interesting data lies is those cases when you're at parity and maybe you are slightly outspending your opponent. So first thing to look at is how important it is to spend the 1 mana on turn 1, because that's usually the biggest bottleneck in mana curves in Limited. You don't want to overload on 1-drops, so you're not guaranteed to play the 1-drop. But 1-drops, especially in the recent years, are pretty good. So exactly how does it change the game outcomes when you played the 1-drop and the opponent didn't, which means that you outspent your opponent on turn 1 by 1 mana. You can't outspend them by more than 1 mana in first turns, hopefully. And there is an effect. So as I said, if you're on parity on turn 1, you're roughly at the 0. So you have average win rate. But if you spend 1 more mana on the play and than your opponent did on turn 1, you have 2.4 percentage points higher win rate. And if opponent outspent you, you have 2.2 percentage point higher win rate. So it's not a big difference, but 2 percentage points actually is the difference between a medium archetype and a decent archetype and a very good archetype. So it is something that is happening on this turn 1. Then the second thing, and I see already that in the chat, that's why I paused, because reading chat and blabbing is difficult. Second part that I wanted to show you is how important, when you're on the play, it is to outspend your opponent in those first turns. If you see on turn 2, if you outspend your opponent by 1 mana, this increases your win rate by 4.1 percentage points. If you were outspent by 1 mana, it's 4.9. If you outspend by 2, it's already 11 percentage points higher win rate, and it's proportional on turn 2. Basically, whoever outspends on turn 2 is going to gain a massive advantage. If you spend 3 mana and your opponent spends 0 by turn 2, you're going to have 13.8% percentage point higher win rate than the average, and it's vice versa. If the player on the draw outspend the player on the play by 3 mana by turn 2, it's going to be 13.4 percentage points difference in win rate there. Now, the big thing, I think, and that's like probably the biggest thing in terms of mana usage, is outspending your opponent by just 1 mana on turns 3, 4, or 5. This is cumulative, so it doesn't show that you outspend them by 1 mana on turn 5 only, but up till turn 5. If you are on parity on turns 3, 4, and 5, you roughly have 1.6, 1.9 percentage points higher win rate. Why? Well, because you have the initiative. So you started spending the mana first, you can attack first, you have better choices, you can attack, and if they block, you can have tricks and things like that. So you can utilize the fact that you started better, and that's why you get this slight boost, even if you're on parity of mana up until turn 5. But if you outspend them by just 1 mana, all of a sudden it increases to 8 percentage points advantage. Turn 3, 8 percentage turn 4, and 7 percentage points turn 3. While it's absolutely not the same when you outspend your opponent and you're on the draw. When you're outspending your opponent on the draw, you only have 4.5 percentage points advantage on turn 3, as opposed to 8. On turn 4, it's even smaller. It's just 3 percentage points advantage, while it's 8 for opposite situation, and it's almost 0 when you outspend your opponent on turn 5, and 7 percentage points when you were on the play. So this shows you like how important it is to have good curve outs when you're on the play, because it gives you such a huge advantage in the game, and you're so much favored when you spend it. The bigger the overspending, the smaller the gain. So if you overspend by outspend your opponent by 3 mana by turn 5, either way the effect is similar. But especially like those little differences in how much mana you spend in the first 5 turns are massive boon for the player that is on the play. That's exactly JPSN. It's not even 1 mana every turn. It's more like if by turn 5 I spend 10 mana and my opponent spent 9, I am massively advantaged in that situation if I was on the play. And I'm not advantaged at all if I was on the draw. But then, as you can see, at mana spending parity, you have this evenness on turn 1, and then there's the increase, like 1.5 percentage point to 2 percentage points at turn 6 when you're on parity, when you were on the play, because you still have the initiative to accrue that value. That thing disappears on turn 7, and on turn 7 it's back to parity when you're on even spending, and then it goes below. So if you're even spending by turn 8, 9, 10, you're actually disadvantaged as a player on the play. And if you outspend your opponent by even 1 mana on turn 9, remember, on turn 5 it was 7 percentage points higher win rate. On turn 9, when the same thing happens, you're still disadvantaged. So you're still having below average win rate. You have to outspend them by quite a lot more by turn 9 in order to be favored. And this, of course, is linked to the fact that they have more cards, naturally. They didn't have to pay any mana to get that 1 extra card over you, which means, again, better selection, more resources, and potential to turn the game over, because you didn't utilize that initiative that you had in the first couple of turns, and you didn't gain enough advantage. You didn't outspend your opponent. All of a sudden, because they managed to stabilize, or they managed to stay alive long enough for that 1 card extra to start mattering. And then we see a slightly opposite situation. If we had those differences between spending 1 more mana on turns 3, 4, and 5 for the player on the play in the later game, and we already discussed it earlier, players who are on the draw are more likely to spend more mana. If you spend 3 mana more by turn 8, 9, or 10, you have 7 percentage points higher win rate than the average. If you outspend it while you're on the play, it's only 4 percentage points. So yeah, and it's a very good comment there for Donut Slayer 808. This very clearly explains why it's almost always right to bolt the bird, so kill the mana dork. Yeah, I think that this is like probably the best confirmation of that heuristics you can get. If you bolt the bird, you deny them having that extra mana, and even if you pay for that by not being as aggressive as you could have been, you go you're going to go so much behind on how much mana you spend and the quality of the threats you are going to deploy. So like, I lost so many games in this format because my opponent just golems bit in my Woes Pathfinder, and I couldn't bounce back from it. Especially that bird is also part of your mana fixing. That's going to be doubly painful. So yeah, Bolt the Bird is confirmed by this data quite well. Thanks, Donut Slayer, for the suggestion. I didn't even plan to talk about it, but now my content is much more better because people ask questions and make comments in the chat. There you go. So here we have the correlation between the mana spending difference on turn 6, just like we had with the life total. And you can see it's very similar levels of correlation of the data, R squared of 0.9945. And here again, we have this coefficient that shows you how steep is the curve. And this time it's 0.0341, which means, like previously, 3.4 percentage points difference by each mana that you spend more, which means if you spend one more mana, you will on average gain 0.3 percentage points of win rate. And if you spend one less, you will lose the 0.34 percentage point win rate. And here we have a slightly different curve, but it probably is mainly because I included the turn 1 and 2, which I didn't include with life, because there's not much going on with life totals in the first 2 turns. But on turn 1, the outspending, each mana that you spend extra is only giving you 2.3 percentage points extra win rate. On turn 2, that goes up to 4.8. It reaches the peak on turn 3 at 5.4. This is like the importance of those first 3 turns. On turn 3, every mana that you spend more than your opponent means you have a 5.4 percentage point higher win rate. The curve out of 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop is a real thing. And then it starts dropping. At 4, it's still pretty decent 5 percentage points difference. So again, every mana more that you spend by turn 4 is 5 percentage points in your win rate. And then it drops to 4.2, 3.4, 2.6, 2.1, 1.8, 1.6. So at turn 10, again, spending 1 mana more than your opponent by turn 10 is a marginal impact on win rate. Still some, but marginal. And again, all those things are quite well correlated. So there is like a high correlation between those across the board. It might flatten a bit on the extreme values. So the difference between outspending your opponent by 16 as to 17 mana on turn 10 is not that big, but you would expect that to happen. Does this data lend to the effect of playing taplands? Now, this is unfortunately something that I can't analyze for this set, because here taplands are not taplands but mana cyclers, which means that they will be using mana and will be included in this data as mana. It would be interesting to repeat this analysis in the set where taplands are there, and maybe even see how big is an impact of playing a tapland on particular turn and how painful it is to your win rate. Because we could technically do that. Let's say count the win rate if you play the tapland on turn 1, count the win rate if you play the tapland on turn 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. We're actually going to look at missing land drops, which is slightly similar, and you could do technically same kind of analysis for taplands very easily. But here, land cycling, I could have maybe done it, but it would have required developing a whole system for how to analyze it, and I tried to do a lot, and in the end, I just had to make a cutoff somewhere. So maybe next time, if we have a set with taplands and the replay data, I could actually look at the impact of taplands, because I think that would be interesting. Because again, as per Preamble, this is the kind of place where opinion rules, because no one really bothered to analyze the data stringently. Now, for card draw, I didn't look at every turn like I did for the previous ones, because I had a very, very easy column in the data that shows cards drawn per game. So I could look at the difference for all the games between 17 land users and their opponents, how many cards they drew across the board. That's why if you're on parity, the win rate is going to be exactly 50%, because it takes all the games into account, and both 17 lens user and non-17 lens user. So obviously, if they're on parity, one of them will win. So their win rate is going to be exactly 50%. But as you can see, if you draw more cards you are going to increase the win rate, and if you draw fewer cards than your opponent, the difference does decrease. And here again, the correlation is really strong, especially between like 7 cards less, 7 cards more. Then it sort of flattens out on the ends here and here. But here it's almost perfectly linear, and it's roughly 3.3 percentage points per extra card drawn than your opponent. Fundavunk -8 and 9, that's probably variance. At the extremes, data sets, the sample sizes are smaller, so you would expect some minor variance effects. It's still amazing that those things are so stringent, to be fair, because you would expect more noise in this kind of data set, but I don't see it. Time and time again, those things look like they've been produced by faking the data a lot. Like, if I was perfect, maybe this one should be like 52.5, and that would be perfectly straight. But anyway, this is as much as you can expect from complicated data sets. So I'm very massively impressed by how it looks like. So yeah, each extra card that you draw will roughly translate to 3.3 percentage point higher win rate. Obviously, there will be games when you play Lorien Revealed, draw 3 extra cards, and die the next turn. It's going to happen. But assuming that you are playing your card draw in the right moments, and that you have 2-for-1 kind of card draws, you will roughly get this kind of effect. What was interesting, and I didn't do the graphs in the end, I think, you could also look at number of cards you discard per game, which was a neat way of quasi-measuring how important is that level 2 of the ring. Because in some games, people discarded like 8 cards, and then you could see that also that they drew so many cards. And even though it doesn't net you the cards, it doesn't show the net difference, selection is just strong enough. And that, now I'm thinking, was the analysis that I probably should have done, looking at also the net card difference, because there are plenty of effects in this set that require you to discard a card and draw a card, including cycling, including ring, including Coral's End, and Bath Song, which offer more selection than net card draw, but also some net card draw. But yeah, a discarding card was also positively correlated with the win rate. The more cards you discarded, the more games you won, which is funny because that's not what you would expect. But in this set, of course, discarding means drawing as well. Yeah, Fundavung. So again, I didn't do those graphs. I did a couple of correlational graphs looking at the win rate of players and how often they do things. And it's very interesting that the higher the win rate of the 17 land user in this set, the more cards per game they discard, or per turn of the games that they play, because I normalized it for number of turns. But also their opponents discard fewer cards. So that means to me that top players in this format are not only good in activating the ring, but also good at stopping the opponents from making sure that they are making sure that the opponent will not get the level 2 ring bearer active too much. So there was like this inverse correlation between top players loot more, but also don't allow their opponents to loot. So, okay, now we can move to the land drops statistics. And here we have this graph where we have number of land drops made and turn number. And we have this diagonal, and that diagonal means you didn't miss a land drop basically ever in those games. So you have a 58% win rate in all games because you never missed the first land drop. At least it actually did happen in 14 games, I think, that people dropped their first turn land drop, probably due to misclick or disconnect or not switching to the arena window when they were playing. But except for those 8 games in the remaining 49,992 games, They didn't miss the first land drop, so this is the average win rate on the play of the 17 lens users from the dataset I analyzed. Obviously, they most likely also don't miss the second land drop. At least it happened fewer than 100 times that people missed the land drop. But third land drop misses do happen on the play already. And this is the difference. So if you don't miss your land drop on turn 3, you have a 59.1% win rate. If you did miss the land drop on turn 3, that goes down to 39%. So 20 percentage point difference by just missing that third land drop. So it is pretty big punishment if you don't hit that third land drop, which makes you think you really have to be courageous to keep two lenders, and sometimes you will just miss, and it goes pretty badly. If you go to turn 4, if you didn't miss land drops till turn 4, you got like around 60% win rate. If you missed one land drop, it goes down to 52, which is not a big punishment. So like dropping the third land drop is pretty punishing, but either drawing a land on turn 4 and playing it, or just making first 3 land drops and then dropping the fourth land drop is less punishing, but it's still punishing. It's the win rate is going to be 52, but having 2 lands on turn 4, that goes down to 28% win rate. So basically 3/4 of the game, when you miss 2 land drops by turn 4, are going to be ended in your loss. And at turn 5, we see first time that actually missing land drops by that time has a small advantage for you. So if you're stuck on 4 lands on turn 5, 61% win rate. If you didn't miss any land drops until then, it's 57.6, so slightly less. And here we're getting to the territory of land screw versus mana flood. And you can see if you go across the diagonal that not missing a land drop in 7 turns, that's already like 49% win rate. Not missing a land drop in 9-10 turns, there is a slight bump, but it's 54. But it seems like you really want to flatten out onto 6 lands. Now, of course, looking at this data set, you have to keep in mind that a bunch of games will be already finished by here. These are gone from that analysis. And if you're on the play, you're more likely to win those games because you're more likely to win early games because you were on the play, you have the initiative. By turn 6, more games will be finished. By turn 7, more games will be finished. So by turn 10, you are already disadvantaged when you were on the play because you drew 1 card less and you have fewer resources because of that. So keep that in mind, that we're looking here at games that you're already slightly disadvantaged. But even so, you can sort of see that the curve goes like, it's good not to miss your first land drops, and then it starts being okay to miss your land drops, and you want to be probably stuck at 5-6 lands, because that most of the time also means you're starting to loot with your ring bearer, and that might be very format specific in here. And here you see a hint of that happening, that you want to stop. And maybe that there are some decks that really don't want to miss land drops because they are super mana hungry, super late game kind of decks that actively don't want to miss a land drop. And in case of those decks, it's per design that you don't want to miss the land drops because you are so resource hungry. But in lots of decks, drawing too many lands and flooding out will be correlated with a decreased win rate. And if you see the same graph on the draw, first of all, you see win rate on draw is significantly lower. It's 53.6% rather than 58. So 4.5 percentage points difference. And here you clearly see that effect when you stop at 5-6 lands of the increase of the mana of the win rate. So if at turn 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 you're stuck on those 5-6 lands, That means you probably started activating your ring bearer, discarding the lands, getting fuel, and stabilizing the game. And because you were advantaged in the later game, because you drew more cards anyway, naturally, you're starting to have the 60s, 58, 57% win rate. So it shows that it's really painful to miss a land drop, because still, not playing a land on turn 3 is 29% win rate versus 54% win rate when you played all your lands by turn 3. So massive hit, 15 percentage points difference. But later it's I think less punishing than, actually maybe it's more punishing or similar punishing. But you get a bigger advantage of getting stuck on those 5-6 lands. So probably this format, at least, is the format where you most likely want to be stuck on 5-6 lands and use the ring bearer to make sure that your draws are done. And if you're playing an aggressive deck, you just don't want to go beyond turn 7 anyway, or turn 8. So it doesn't really matter that much, those turns. They don't matter that much for you, those turns. Okay, and I have the last part. I basically had a bunch of data there in the data set that just had a full measurement. Like, for example, here, number of cards drawn and the win rate. And by win rate, I don't mean the win rate of the decks, but win rate of the players. So just to give you an impression, this means that players who are roughly 50% average win rate, they draw roughly 10 cards per game. And players that have 70% win rate, they draw roughly 10.5 cards per game, well, slightly above it. And this means that a player with a higher win rate will draw half a card more in their games. And I looked at it, and it correlates quite well, because as you can see, the higher the win rate of the player, the more cards they will draw per game on average. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I can look at those data. And then I started looking at all the other variables that I could find and maybe select some of you, because I don't want to bore you with like 25 of the same graph. I only limited myself to 8-ish maybe. But just show you some of those interesting correlation, and maybe you can help me speculate, or I can help you speculate. Why do I think that those things might be correlated? So I looked at this cards drawn to win rate, and I thought, fine, that looks pretty well correlated. I measured the R-squared. I measured the Pearson's correlation coefficient, just to look at the most interesting one when those two numbers are quite high. And yeah, cards drawn was definitely one of them. I also looked at the cards discarded to win rate, and that was also quite a good positive correlation. And at that moment, I just realized, yeah, but maybe it's just because players who have higher win rate, their games last a bit longer. So I went back. I stopped this analysis. I didn't throw it away completely, but I said, okay, let's try to maybe normalize it by the length of the game, or let's just see if there is anything going with the length of the game. And I actually looked at it, and good players play shorter games. So quite the opposite of that. So if I think, maybe because they draw more cards because they play longer games, that's absolutely not true. They play shorter games probably because they are better at finding lethal, better at crafting a good plan. And this, of course, means that when I thought that cards drawn to win rate is a strong correlation, it's actually even stronger than that. And hard to show it on the graphs when you have such small differences, but this is what I did. Is I calculated how many cards do players draw every turn depending on their win rate. And this is actually a much stronger correlation than the first one I shown, even though that one looks more steep, but that's just how graphs work, basically. This correlation is actually stronger. It's more stringent, and basically the difference is a really high win rate player will draw like 1.17 cards per turn, a low win rate player will draw like 1.1, 1.12 cards per turn. Small differences, but it's per turn. So over games, they will draw cards more than their opponents will do. The difference between 1.1 and 1.17 is 0.07 cards a turn. So that's per turns 0.7 cards in a longer game. That's quite a lot. Which means that they either build their decks in such a way that they can draw more cards, they make sure that their ring is more active, and all those small differences accrue. And there seems to be at least a link between the ability of drawing more cards and winning more games. It's a complex issue why that happens, but just observing the correlation is something that is potentially useful. Then I looked at the same, again, normalizing it per turn, how much mana players spend per turn. And I'm not super happy about this because obviously the longer the game, the more lands you have. So if the best players play shorter games, that's disproportionately affecting them. I would have to normalize it even further, but I didn't feel like doing that. So I just did a simple spending per turn. But still, even though they play shorter games, every turn they spend more mana on average than the players with lower win rate. And we're looking at players with like 44% win rate will spend 2.9 mana every turn. Players with like 68% win rate, they will spend 3.05 mana per turn. So 0.15 mana difference every turn. And it's, again, relatively stably increasing kind of thing. 0.15 mana per turn, again, means that every 7 turn you will spend 1 more mana extra, independent if you're on the play or on the draw. And again, these things will be linked to a win rate. So when you think about it, that they will spend 1 mana extra in a game, and the game is lasting 8 turns on average, we can go back to our mana spending table, and we will see that only this will sort of account by 2.1 percentage points difference in win rate across those games. So this is just an extra win rate from being able to spend more mana. And this is only a part of the difference of the win rate. Part of it will be card evaluation, ability to navigate drafts, ability to pick the right cards. But using the resources will be a measurable effect that you can attribute to building your decks in such a way that they are more conducive to spending all your mana every turn. And then just as a last one, just to show you that, because it's always easy to fall into a trap that I'm going to show you those really neat results that always show something interesting happen. I looked at many metrics, and some of them are strongly linked with or strongly correlated with the win rate of the player, but some of them are absolutely not. And one thing that was definitely not correlated with the win rate was the number of creatures cast. And I didn't have any expectations for that graph. I could see that better players play more creatures, but also I know that better players, or higher win rate players, they play more Izzet, and Izzet is more spells than creatures. So I would assume maybe they play more fewer creatures than the people with lower win rates, but I didn't see anything in there. So it's basically flat across the board, independent of who is playing. They roughly play half a creature every turn, and that's it. So yeah, not every of those metrics shows you anything interesting. One thing that I did find, and I'm not showing you the graphs here, but I'm going to tell you, there is, and again, one of those inverse kind of correlations between top win rate players and lower win rate players. Top winner players will play more instants and sorceries, and that's in line with them playing Izzet more or Dimir. So they will play more instants and sorceries per turn on average, but they will play fewer non-creature spells that are not instants and sorceries. So it seems to me that lower win rate players will play more of the non-creature artifacts, auras, enchantments, and things like this. And players with a higher win rate will avoid those. But they will play more instants and sorceries because probably there is a good reason to play them because there are payoffs and they are utilizing additional synergy. So I think that one of the traps is, playing decks that have too many of those auras and rather than instants and sorceries. Donut Slayer 808, does this include creatures from instants and sorceries like Rally? Unfortunately, no. It only counts things that have creature in their type of the spell. So that's, no, it would require a lot of extra work to add those by manually, basically, to the list and count them as creatures. And it's always complicated. Do I count Orcish Medicine as a creature or not? Is a problem that you would have to run into that arbitrary. So it's maybe better to just look at because you can also separately look at the instants and sorceries and then draw conclusions from that. But yeah, I think that it was packed enough, this seminar, in terms of stuff. So as always, I would like to thank 17 Lands team. This data set, I know how much pain it is to generate. So huge shout out to Ale Baldini, who is now probably now sleeping, but generally probably relaxing on a well-deserved holiday and gathering strength to get Eldraine data online in time. So thanks to him for all the amazing work he's doing. And thanks to Fake Jake Brown for helping me with releasing this as a podcast. Also, as we talk about the podcast, thanks to SSCO and Mana Junkie for the music I use as an intro. Thanks to ntgazone.com, and thanks to my patrons again, Tabiket, Tal, Pingus, Pangus, and Thomas. Thank you very much for joining the Patreon. The more the merrier, it seems. And with that, I'll see you next week.